get started now, and I guess more folks will fill in as the time goes. Just quick and kind of obvious housekeeping rule, if we could all just turn our phones to silent or vibrate, that would be much appreciated. Very good, so I'll begin. Thank you all for coming. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tarek Patterson. I'm the Vice Coordinator for External Relations for 4 Members Only, which is our Black Student Alliance here on campus. And welcome to our 5th installment of the Legacy of X talks, screenings, lectures, assemblies. I'm not exactly sure what to call them because every year it takes on a different form due to the imagination of the students who plan this event. So thank you for all those who had a hand in doing so. This year, marking the first year that we've co-sponsored Legacy of X, FMO has asked MCSA to help us in organizing a program that will bring X's faith, often overlooked, into greater relief. A program that challenges us to consider X's legacy and his legend without exception. The initial aim of Legacy of X was both to commemorate X and to celebrate the diversity of Black history. The students who conceived of this event found it frustrating that people used to think of Malcolm X and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King as polar opposites. And on the contrary, towards the end of both of their lives, their messages actually became more and more similar. Talking about Malcolm X and his legacy was a way to take our own history by the reins, to tell our own story, represent our own leaders, celebrate our own culture, and remember history correctly. The impetus for this tradition was the urgency of eliminating the simplistic story of Malcolm X. And in preparing the history of this event for you, our historian reached out to the board members of the 2008-2009 executive board who started this event, and one of them left us with a brief anecdote, which I'll read to you right now, and I quote, "Our education system paints an image of him as contentious, malevolent, and a vindictive soapbox leader, or it does not paint a picture at all. I did a quick poll of 20 high school students as I walked through the hallway of my school, and most of them did not know who he was. Did not know who he was. The one who was familiar with him asked, well, isn't he known for by any means necessary? So essentially, we started the program to expose students to the complexity of Malcolm, the man, and his legacy. He lived a transformative life that was rooted in the ideals of self-respect, collective efficiency, integrity, and education, and his life should be celebrated annually." End quote. The history of Black folks is rich, and it is a textured narrative populated by diverse individuals, defined by brilliant pioneers, and driven forward by both. The people that make up this patchwork are like the history of the patchwork itself, complex and multivalent. The identities of Black people, diverse as they are, routinely build bridges to alternative cultures, experiences, and faiths. This evening we want to examine Malcolm anew in consideration of his faith, and to reread his history against the grain of our present understanding. I'm extremely excited about tonight's events, and now I will turn it over to MCSA, who will move us forward in our program. I'd like to thank you all once again for joining us.
I'm a little short. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace be upon you all. MCSA is excited to collaborate with FMO on their annual event to learn more about the impact of Malcolm X's faith on his work, something often overlooked. This event is part of Northwestern Muslim Cultural Student Association's Discover Islam Week, an annual event where we hold firesides and lectures to inform the public about Islam and the Muslim community here at Northwestern. This year, our theme for Discover Islam Week is Our Jihad, Our Struggle. With our events throughout the week, MCSA hopes to shed light on the various roles of Muslims in America and the various struggles they encounter. Before we begin the event, I'd like to ask Kareem to come up here and recite a passage from the Quran with Imtisal to translate the passage.
يكن غنيا أو فقيرا فالله أولى بهما فلا تتبعوا الهوى أن تعدلوا وإن تلووا أو تعرضوا فإن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا.
O you who have believed, be persistently standing firm in justice, witnesses for God, even if it be against yourselves or parents and relatives. Whether one is rich or poor, God is more worthy of both. So follow not personal inclination, lest you not be just. And if you distort your testimony or refuse to give it, then indeed God is ever with what you do acquainted.
So thank you for the reading of that scripture. The hope is that it would kind of set the tone for the event this evening. And right now I just kind of want to also help in just kind of breaking the monotony of talking at you guys for, an hour, however long we're here. And so what I'll do is I'm going to read a couple of passages from select speeches and published works by Malcolm X. And I'll explain the significance of those things later and just do a quick canvas of the room just to kind of see who it is that we're speaking to here. So I'll begin and I'll let you know when the quotations break into another one. The first one reads, and the average black American who has been real brainwashed, he never wants to be accused of being emotional. You ever watch them? Have you ever watched one of them? Do that. Watch them. Watch the real bourgeois black Americans. He never wants to show any sign of emotion. He won't even tap his feet. You can have some real soul music, and he'll sit there, like it doesn't move him. I watch him, and I'm telling you. And the reason he tries to pretend like it doesn't move him is because he knows that it does not move them. And it does not move them because they cannot feel it. They've got no soul. And he's got to pretend he has none, just to make it with them. The next quote reads, I'm not anti-Democrat, I'm not anti-Republican. I'm just questioning their sincerity and some of the strategy that they've been using on our people by promising them promises that they don't intend to keep. When you keep the Democrats in power, you keep the Dixiecrats in power. The next quote reads, when these people in these different areas begin to see that the problem is the same problem, and when the 22 million black Americans see that our problem is the same as the problem of the people who are being oppressed in South Vietnam and the Congo and Latin America, then the oppressed people of this earth make them a majority, not a minority. Then we approach our problem as a majority that can demand, not a minority that has to beg. And the last quote I want to read for you reads, the Western press tries to make it appear that there is a division among Africans. In any bloc or group that has a common objective, you will find disagreements, but overall, there is unity. Excuse me, I have one more that I want to read for you. No, the fruit, you asked another question within that. The fruit of Islam are the brothers who have been reformed, rehabilitated, who don't drink, don't smoke, don't commit fornication or adultery, don't become involved in any kind of crime, who learn how to respect their women. Now, I read all of those things for you because I wanted to reflect that Malcolm X has a broad range of topics that he talks about. He's not a one-track-minded thinker, philosopher, activist. He talks about a lot of different things. Women, I don't think he was talking directly about music. He was trying to make a larger point, but I'm not going to miss a chance to, talk to somebody about music. It's just my thing, kind of, a little bit. And before this event, we extended an invitation for you guys to participate in a campaign called X Wants to Know. You can see the hashtag that's listed right there. And the purpose of that was to kind of engage you all in an exercise of restraint, as it were. Not to talk about X's views as you see them, not to even talk about your impression of Malcolm X, but to talk about rather how Malcolm X would question us and how we would give an account for ourselves in today's age, not skewing the question one way or another, but just sincerely trying to approximate his voice and to ask what he would want to know of us today. Some of you listed different things that X wants to know. I myself posted something to the effect of X wants to know why it is that the idea of black proprietorship is threatening to some and why it means nothing to others. This is just an example of something that you could kind of move forward on. And I just want to invite you all to continue to send those tweets in, send those postings, and kind of continue this dialogue beyond this room, because I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have. You can tweet it if you have Twitter to FMO _NU or NUNCSA. So moving forward, I'm sure that we all have diverse interests and worldviews similarly to X. We kind of embody as a group who he was as a man. So I'd just like to ask you all to stand if you identify with the categories I'm going to call out right now. So now, if you identify as a student at Northwestern or any other institution, could you just please stand and be seated? As I suspected. If you identify as a faculty member at Northwestern or any other institution, could you please stand and be seated shortly after? Thank you. If you identify as a staff member at Northwestern or any other institution, could you do the same? Thank you. If you are a member of a religious faith of any kind, would you please stand and be seated shortly after? Perfect. If you are connected to or engaged with the international community in one way or another, could you please stand and be seated shortly after? Perfect. If you identify as a student of black politics, could you stand and be seated shortly after? So with authority. Interesting, thank you. And lastly, if you are familiar with an inclusionary representation of X's politics, could you stand and be seated shortly after? Great, thank you. I think that reflects quite a wide range of people here with us today. In closing, I would just encourage you to keep on pushing forward that X Wants to Know campaign. I think it's really worthwhile. It'd be a really great way to kind of continue the conversation that we begin in this room in the online community that we're all a part of. So thank you once again, and at this time, I will invite somebody to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thank you, Terry, for that. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight's event. Zaheer Ali is a scholar, activist, and teacher whose work focuses on African American history and religion, and who has taught courses on African American history, Islam in America, and Malcolm X. He formerly served as project manager of Columbia University's Malcolm X project, and served as a lead researcher on the late Manning Marable's Pulitzer Prize-winning Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention. He is currently completing his PhD in history at Columbia, His dissertation focuses on the history of the Nation of Islam in Harlem. Please join me in welcoming Zaheer Ali.
So first of all, good afternoon, good evening. I want to thank all of the sponsors for this event, and that includes, make sure I don't miss anyone, the Office of the President, the Multicultural Student Affairs Office, the African American Studies Department, the History Department, the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program, of which I'm proud to be an alum, of course, the Muslim Cultural Students Association, and for members only. I am very honored and grateful to have this chance to speak to you about Malcolm X, and I couldn't think of a better introduction than, not of me, that was a great introduction, but a better introduction for the program than the quotes that Tariq read out to you, and they actually kind of complement my presentation, hopefully, because I'm not going to use those quotes, so you'll have additional information. When I started thinking about this topic, the title of my talk is Black and Muslim, and the Struggle for Justice. And then I got word of this Twitter campaign, and I thought, wow, they kind of threw me for a loop here with this. But what I really like about this Twitter campaign is the way it does turn the tables on us who study history. A lot of times, I think a lot of people treat history as a kind of mystery 8-ball, WWMD, what would Malcolm do? Shake it. Would Malcolm vote for Obama? Shake it. And that's ahistorical, right? I was doing an interview for a network last week, and one of the questions they asked me is, what would Malcolm think about Obama? And I'm like, there's a whole 50 years of time that has passed that we can't account for, right? That's an ahistorical question, right? Malcolm doesn't have to give us his analysis of Obama. We have to explain Obama in light of Malcolm's legacy, right? That job is on us, right? And so I really like this X wants to know hashtag campaign, because it causes us to think, or inspires us to think, what questions does Malcolm's legacy raise for us today? How would we explain the homicide rate in Chicago to Malcolm, right? How would we explain the debate over gun violence in light of Malcolm's legacy? How would we explain the Obama presidency, on the one hand, something to celebrate, but on the other hand, something to be very weary of with the use of drone warfare, right? So these are questions that Malcolm can't answer, right? These are questions that we have to answer, but they're questions that I think Malcolm's legacy helps to inspire. Now, in thinking about Malcolm and his relationship to faith, which is part of, I think, an important question that we need to raise, I thought of a good way to start was by looking at this stamp, this postage stamp, which was issued by the U.S. Postal Service in 1999. And the United States wasn't the first country to issue a Malcolm X stamp. Actually, one of the first countries to issue a Malcolm X stamp was the Islamic Republic of Iran in the 80s, right? So we were slow, Public Enemy, most of my heroes don't appear on those stamps, yes, we're late, as usual. But what's interesting about this presentation, of course, it raises a lot of questions about the United States' celebration of Malcolm, and how does the United States celebrate Malcolm, right? And there was a debate over what picture they would use. We don't want an angry-looking Malcolm because that isn't what we want to put on our stamps. We don't want NOI Malcolm, so find a Malcolm with a beard, right? Because this is the post-Meccan Malcolm that supposedly, comes back with a kind of racial enlightenment view. So there was a debate over what image that they would choose for the stamp. And the image that they actually chose for the stamp was this one. And this image was taken in Cairo in July 14, 1964, when Malcolm was planning to sit in on the meetings of the Organization of African Unity, with the hopes of convincing the delegates there to bring the United States before the World Court of the United Nations for crimes against African Americans, right? So it's interesting that the U.S. Postal Service uses as their official Malcolm X stamp an image that is cropped and disembodied from the original context in which that image took place. And I thought this was a good way of thinking about how Malcolm's image is appropriated, how it's disembodied, how it's cut up into pieces. And you know, the U.S. Postal Service, they aren't the only ones that do this. We do this, right? All of us claim parts of history that we feel most comfortable with, that we feel justifies or legitimates our worldview. So, you know, this is just something for us to think about. But the other reason why I like this picture is because Malcolm is sitting in Cairo, which was kind of at that point at the intersection of two worlds that he was growing as a member of, right? So he's there to meet with the members of the Organization of African Unity, but he's also in Egypt, and he is a guest of Gamal Abdel Nasser, right? Who was the Egyptian president, and Malcolm is kind of at the intersection of two worlds at this point. The African diaspora and the Muslim, I won't say the Muslim world, but you know, the Muslim quote-unquote world, right? Because there's no singular world, but the Muslim diaspora, let's say. That was his third trip to Africa and the Middle East. And he spent from July to November of '64, nearly 16 weeks he spent in Africa and the Middle East, living, studying, absorbing, evolving, thinking, campaigning, lobbying. And these are, this time in Malcolm's life is not a time that most people are aware of or know about. And I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of why. But on his second trip, he had gone there to Africa and the Middle East earlier that year in '64, in April, when he went to make the pilgrimage, the Hajj to Mecca. And he wrote in his diary, and I'm going to try to read it here. I hope you can see the wording, but this is from his diary. He says, "I must leave here by Saturday so I don't miss my African trip. Our success in America will involve two circles, Black nationalism and Islam. It will take Black nationalism to make our people conscious of doing for self, and then Islam will provide the spiritual guidance. Black nationalism will link us to Africa, and Islam will link us spiritually to Africa, Arabia, and Asia." And I think this is a really important way of understanding Malcolm's evolution, right? In particular, his use of circles and language. In part because Malcolm attempted, or was part of a project to introduce a new geography for Black people in America, a new orientation, a new location, a new spatial sense of being in the world, right? Because the prevailing sense was, you know, this was the circle, right? The African Americans, Black America, confined within the borders or boundaries of the United States, right? A white majority country, a Black minority population, and the only way to achieve justice was to appeal to that majority through the civil rights movement, right? Malcolm suggested and fought for an alternative political geography, right, that put African Americans in the context of the African diaspora, which now put them in a majority population, right? Not only did it put them in a majority population, but he sought to move the discussion of the treatment of African Americans from a domestic context of civil rights to an international context of human rights, right? And then finally was an alternative spiritual geography that even expanded that political geography more to include Asia and the Middle East, or Arabia. Now, why are these alternate geographies important, right? Well, in terms of thinking about, when I'm saying geography, you know, it's like our sense of the country, right? So communities and countries and nations begin with an idea, right? They don't begin with a place, they begin with an idea. They are imagined communities that are then legitimated. The territories for these communities are then legitimated by boundaries, right? So geographies encode hierarchies. The boundaries of these spaces are legitimized by narratives that are enforced through hegemonic power, right? So people have an idea like we all constitute the same people, right? So here's our common idea, right? We have a common story, right? So now we have to form a nation. This is the history of all nations, including the United States, right? We form a nation, and here are the boundaries of the nation. And here is the narrative that explains or justifies the existence of our nation, right? The Declaration of Independence, right, is the kind of raison d'etre for the United States' existence, right? The Constitution provides the narrative for the United States' existence. But even the Constitution encodes certain hierarchies, right? The 3/5 Compromise. You know, if anyone's been following that debate with the Emory University president, knows or have heard the 3/5 Compromise. This is the compromise for Southern representation that counted African Americans as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of taxation and representation, encoding and hierarchy. Alternative geographies recover the narratives of others and pose a counter-hegemonic challenge. Okay, so when I'm talking about hegemony here, I'm talking about Antonio Gramsci's notion of cultural hegemony, right? And that notion is that the things that we accept as normal, as given in our society, culturally, politically, and so forth, are actually not inevitable realities. They are constructed, socially constructed realities. And they're socially constructed realities by those in power in order to legitimate their power and subordination of lesser classes, right? And so, to give you a kind of pop culture reference of what hegemony looks like, the Matrix film, right? I don't know if you all were, yeah, you all are old enough to have seen the Matrix. I tried this with one of my classes, and they were like, the Matrix. The Matrix illustrates this notion of hegemony, right? Where people are kind of in a world that they don't question, they don't challenge the authority because it controls their worldview, right? Now, how do you come up with a countervailing view? How do you come up with an alternative way of looking at the world that nurtures a prophetic voice? And I'm using prophetic here in terms of a voice that is able to speak critically about and to a community and the people in power in that community, right? So where do you get an alternative vision if everyone is consumed by the same hegemonic culture, right? That lords over them and, you know, feeds them pleasure or feeds them consumerism, right? Where do you get an alternative worldview that feeds a prophetic voice and a revolutionary praxis? For Malcolm, where did this start, right? In 1925, right? Is this when it all began? Was it when he went to prison? You know, did that cause him to look at the world differently? Was it when he was introduced to the Nation of Islam and eventually joined in 1952? Did that cause him to look at the world differently? Or was it when he went to Mecca in 1964? Now, here's where we participate in the disembodiment of Malcolm. Because depending on your ideological or maybe theological perspective, you will settle on one or more of these, right? There are many Muslims who come from the kind of traditional Islamic perspective who don't want to deal with Malcolm until he goes to Mecca, right? Because as far as they're concerned, until Malcolm goes to Mecca, he's not a Muslim, right? There are many who are nationalists, right? They don't want to hear what Malcolm said when he comes back from Mecca, right? Because they want the emphasis on racial justice that they heard most loudly and forcefully when Malcolm was a minister in the Nation of Islam, right? And there are other ways that people disembody Malcolm. But let's start with Malcolm Little. So of course, yeah, this is Malcolm Little. Malcolm Little, he was born in 1925, and Malcolm himself participates in this kind of revision of his own history. If you've read, how many people have read the autobiography of Malcolm X? Okay. How many people have seen Spike Lee's movie X? Okay, this is a good crowd. All right. Not that you aren't good if you haven't seen it, but, you know, or haven't read it. So according to, if you just read Malcolm's autobiography, Malcolm himself paints his kind of pre-conversion days as a day of himself being kind of lost in this hegemonic culture, right? A time of unconsciousness, right? When he's lost. But the truth of the matter is Malcolm's family, his parents, both his mother and father, were very active in Marcus Garvey's movement, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was the first and most successful black mass movement in America's 20th century, giving many of the kind of founding principles of black nationalism. Marcus Garvey, who was a Jamaican immigrant who came to the United States, formed the UNIA to promote the establishment of independent, autonomous black institutions, right? Marcus Garvey promoted the do-for-self idea, the forming of black businesses, the celebration of black culture, the celebration of black aesthetic, and Malcolm's parents were very active. Not only was his father, Earl Little, an evangelist for Marcus Garvey's organization, but his mother also wrote for Marcus Garvey's newspaper, The Negro World. And you can see here an article that Louise Little, she actually wrote a lot of the kind of field reports for the organizing of the UNIA. And read these reports to Malcolm Little, right? So as a child, Malcolm was his father was taking him to these meetings with the UNIA, and his mother was reading him reports. He saw both parents involved in organizational work, right? So X wants to know, what do you read? What did you read when you were a child? X wants to know, what do your parents read to you? What do you read to your children, or to your nieces or nephews or young cousins, right? The next phase in Malcolm's development was as Detroit read. Now, this is an interesting time in Malcolm's life because if you read the autobiography, Malcolm paints this time as his life as his most degraded state of being, right? This is when he has the conked hair, so he's completely brainwashed. He's wearing the zoot suit. He's lost in culture. But what's interesting about this time is that, I think Malcolm is a little too uncharitable about his time as Detroit Red. First of all, the zoot suit evolved out of, in part, a protest movement. Because during World War II, there was rationing of food and materials, including cotton, right? And you can see these zoot suits, I call them Steve Harvey suits. You see these zoot suits, but they use a lot of fabric, right? Eventually, it became illegal to produce and sell a zoot suit, right? Because it violated the cotton ration. So someone who was wearing the zoot suit was rebelling against not just the law, but the cultural norm of the time, right? And the support of the war effort. In fact, in California, there were zoot suit riots, right? The zoot suits were popularized by Mexican-American youth, and they got into skirmishes with servicemen who saw them as in wearing the zoot suits and challenging and not supporting the war effort. And that's another interesting thing about this, the conk. So, people have done a lot of work on black hairstyle politics, right? And although Malcolm characterizes his hair straightening or conking as his emulation of a white aesthetic, the truth of the matter is, with his hair conk, there's no way Malcolm's looking white, right? And most men who were in that zoot suit culture, who were conking their hair, were actually emulating Mexican-American men who were part of that zoot suit culture. That was one. Two, that even when Malcolm or any other person of African descent straightens his or her hair, the result is not white people's hair, right? The result is black hair that's straightened, right? And so that's an important point to make in terms of the kind of cultural politics people ascribe to these cultural practices, and specifically Detroit Red. So I would say that there's something to redeem in terms of the political potential of a Detroit Red. And it is no surprise that there are many hip-hop artists for whom Detroit Red is their jumping off point, whether it's Kanye West or AZ or Lil Wayne. There are several whose point of departure with Malcolm is Detroit Red. And I think, again, this is a disembodied commemoration of Malcolm if that's all you look at is Detroit Red, but it's an important starting point. Okay, so where does the intervention come? Where does Malcolm get this alternative way of looking at himself and his people and his community in the world? Well, he gets that first from the Nation of Islam, right? And, if you've seen Spike Lee's movie, there's a character that Spike Lee invents called Baines that goes through and introduces Malcolm to the Nation of Islam and helps guide him through the conversion process. And the truth of the matter is, and I guess dramatically this would not have been as interesting, is that Malcolm is introduced to the Nation of Islam by his siblings, right? Who began writing him letters telling him about this movement that they had joined. So this is really important because for Malcolm, joining the Nation of Islam is in part a kind of family reunion, right? This is a kind of coming back home for Malcolm in terms of embracing his family, his siblings, but also embracing an organization that in part inherited some of the political programs of Marcus Garvey. The Nation of Islam was founded in 1930. It drew a kind of syncretic combination of black nationalism, of esoteric spirituality, of Islam, of forerunners to Islam, like Noble Drew Ali's Moorish Science Temple. It was a mix, right? So people who I think were familiar with what we would consider traditional or classical Islam would have looked at the Nation of Islam and not recognized a lot of what they found. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't important in terms of shaping Malcolm's vision. What's interesting is that in all of Malcolm's autobiography, he talks about one supernatural event in his life. Just one supernatural event in his life. And that is a vision that he had while he was in prison. And this was dramatized by Spike Lee in his movie Thusly.
I received a letter that day from the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. The dear holy apostle wrote to me, a nobody, a junkie, a pimp, and a convict.
I have come to give you something which can never be taken away from you. I bring to you a sense of your own worth. The word of one human being, the knowledge of self.
It was like a blinding light, and I became aware that he was in the room with me. He wore a dark suit, and on his face I saw a wisdom and pain so old and deep that I could scarcely look at him. But I knew I wasn't dreaming. He was right there with me.
I tell you, the most dangerous creation in the world, in any society, is the man with nothing to lose. You do not need 10 such men to change the world. One will do. The earth belongs to us, the black man. And whatever is around it or on it or in it belongs to us.
And then as suddenly as he came, he was gone. And then I could do it.
Okay. Now, in Malcolm's autobiography, he actually describes a different man. This is the man that Malcolm describes in his autobiography. And he's very clear, a man of Asian continence with straight, dark, oily hair. And that person he describes is W. Farag Muhammad. So, historians are challenged with how do we deal when we encounter historical figures who describe paranormal events, right? And my approach to this is what we call phenomenology. which is you don't try to interpret the event in terms of explain it away. You try to understand how the event functions in the life of the person who says they experienced it, right? You get what I'm saying? So I'm not going to say, Malcolm didn't see that man. I'm just going to say, Malcolm says he saw this man. Let's see how this functioned for him. And in seeing this man, and this was the founder of the Nation of Islam, this was kind of the opening for Malcolm into this new spiritual geography, right? And one of the reasons why I like Spike Lee's clip, although I think that's just fabricated dialogue on the part of the person portraying Elijah Muhammad, but it was true that Elijah Muhammad taught in the Nation of Islam that black people were the original people of the earth and the owners of the entire earth, right? That you should not confine your sense of belonging to the United States of America, right? And this is critical because this launches Malcolm, while he's in prison, beginning his kind of prophetic activism. So he starts by protesting for the proper treatment of those convicts in the prison who had joined him in converting to the Nation of Islam, right? So you see an article here published in 1950, 4 convicts turned Muslims get cells looking to Mecca, right? So again, geography is important because Muslims turn towards Mecca, which is where the original, believed to be the original house of God, the Kaaba is, right? So there's a reorientation in terms of your direction, right? Here's another article that says, local criminals in prison claim Muslim faith now, grow beards, won't eat pork, demand east-facing cells to facilitate prayers to Allah. This is the first recorded activism for the practice of Islam in the prison system, right? Now, did Malcolm know that at the time when he embraced the Nation of Islam, that it was radically different from what we would consider traditional or classical Islam? Because the Nation of Islam taught that Farad Muhammad was the representation of God in person. The Nation of Islam taught that Elijah Muhammad was that person's messenger. The Nation of Islam taught a theology that was designed to counteract the effects of white supremacy by portraying the essence of the divine as originating with black humanity and the demonization of the collective white population, right? So these are not, these are foreign to what we consider traditional Islam. But the question is, it didn't matter, or it didn't really matter to Malcolm, because as far as Malcolm was concerned, he was Muslim. And as a Muslim, he was part of this universal community, right? And his demands as a Muslim are very consistent with Muslims across the board, right? At one point, Malcolm threatened the warden that he would write the Egyptian consulate, right, to tell them that they were, that their Muslim brothers were being denied their freedom of religion, right? So Malcolm is already expanding his geographical worldview, right? He already sees the people of Egypt as his brothers. He's still in prison. It's 1950, right? The first page of Malcolm's FBI file begins with his activism in prison in 1950. This is when the FBI begins paying attention to Malcolm, right? Why would the FBI be interested in a convict in prison who is leading a protest for himself and 3 other people claiming Islam? We'll get to that in a second. So Malcolm gets out of prison in 1952, and as coming out of prison, he officially, formally joins the Nation of Islam. He lives in Detroit for a little bit with his brother, and he comes to the Detroit Temple of the Nation of Islam expecting it to see packed, like this, right? He's like, people should want to hear these teachings, right? And instead, he finds it how I found it when I was 15 minutes early today. Not a lot of people, what's going on? So Malcolm is very excited and becomes a kind of leading evangelist for the movement, and he's sent to different cities. He first goes to Philadelphia, where he spends time there. Then he's sent to New York in 1954, where he helps reestablish the Nation of Islam's community in Harlem. And, you know, part of this kind of being infused with an alternative geography, a counter-hegemonic narrative, right? And a meaning, a sense of meaning that is independent from the dominant narrative of the United States gives Malcolm a kind of boldness and independence, right, with which to act. And we see this in one example, in a case in 1957, there was a police brutality case in New York where a man named Johnson Hinton tried to stop the police in Harlem from beating on a woman, and then they beat on him. But Johnson Hinton was also Johnson X. He was a member of the Harlem Temple of the Nation of Islam, and he was injured, and he was taken to the precinct house where he was held. And, you know, I have issues with Spike Lee's movie, but you've seen, I've already showed you one clip. This is another clip because I think it powerfully illustrates and dramatizes how Malcolm responded.
Who the hell are they supposed to be?
They're brothers of Brother Johnson.
Eddie, let me take a look at that block.
Yeah, we got it, Winston. Relief must have put it down.
Must have.
But you can't see him because you ain't his lawyer.
No lawyer, no see.
Well, until I'm satisfied that Brother Johnson is receiving proper medical care, nobody will move.
Get an ambulance.
Now!
All right, break it up. You got what you wanted.
No, I'm not satisfied. To the hospital.
That's enough. I want these people moved out of here.
Good of Islam or disciplined men. They haven't broken any laws. Yet.
What about them?
That's your headache, Captain. But if Brother Johnson dies, I pity you.
That he'll live. Let's give him the best care we can give. Thank you. Sir.
All right, okay. Now let's disperse this mob. Too much power for one man to have.
That's where Kanye West gets his "no one man should have all that power." Anyway, hip hop aside. From this, Malcolm and the Muslims in Harlem filed one of the most successful lawsuits against the New York Police Department for police brutality. But it's interesting, you know, for people who saw this from the outside, they thought that they saw in Malcolm the embodiment of this power, but in fact, this power was embodied by an entire organization of people, right? The Nation of Islam, as an organization, is an important legacy of X. The X itself comes from the Nation of Islam's practice of naming or renaming its members as a protest of the slave, the so-called slave name, right? But it's important here to think about not just being, you know, Malcolm wasn't just a single individual with an alternative worldview. That wasn't enough, right? That alternative worldview was sustained by an organization of people. Because, you know, the power of that is implied when people talk about cultural hegemony, right? You know, this power is deployed by all instruments of the state institutions, educational institutions, cultural institutions, businesses, industries. They all participate in shaping this cultural worldview, right? Someone with their own worldview does not have a strong chance of prevailing against this hegemonic influence unless they too have institutions that nurture, support, and promote this countervailing worldview, right? So another important legacy of X is organization, right? To support and sustain the alternative ways of looking at the world. With that, Malcolm was successful in challenging the dominant narrative discourse about Black identity in America. So I'm going to play two clips. I feel like I hope I'm not overwhelming you with clips, but I think that, as a historian, we rely on primary sources, so that's what I'm giving you in addition to my kind of commentary. So this is an interview where Malcolm is doing, where he's asked about his name, and you can see the kind of challenge he poses to the discourse in his response.
So-called Negroes, you find some fault with this description?
Yes. Mr. Muhammad teaches us that Negro is a term that was applied to us during slavery by the slave master. And right today, it's a term that is used only to point out the descendant of slaves. It's never used for Black people, period. Africans can come to this country. They aren't called Negroes. And if they are called Negroes, they resent it. So if Negro meant Black, as we've been taught, it would be a term that would be applicable to or applicable to everyone. But he says that it is something that means a slave, or something it means something that has been left out of society, politically, economically, educationally, and otherwise.
You don't think of it as an anthropological term?
Definitely. It's not an anthropological term, it's a slave term. And it was a term that was invented in America and was used by the slave makers, slave traders, and slave masters, and attached to the property or the chattel or merchandise that our people represented in that particular day.
Mr.
O'Connor.
What is your real name?
Malcolm X.
Is that your legal name?
As far as I'm concerned, it's my legal name.
Have you been to court to establish the
I didn't have to go to court to be called Murphy or Jones or Smith. Excuse me for answering you this way.
That's
If
all right.
a Chinese person were to say his name was Patrick Murphy, you would look at him like he's insane, because Murphy is an Irish name, a European name, or the name that has a Caucasian or white background. And a yellow person, Chinese is a yellow man, and he has nothing to do or no connection whatsoever with the name Murphy. And if it doesn't look proper for a person who is yellow or Chinese to be walking around named Murphy or Jones or Johnson or Bunch or Powell, I think it would be just as improper for a black person or the so-called Negro in this country, because we're taught by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad to walk around with these names, and therefore he teaches us that during slavery, the same slave master who owned us put his last name on us to denote that we were his property. So that when you see a Negro today who's named Johnson, if you go back in his history, you'll find that he was once, his grandfather or one of his forefathers was owned by a white man who was named Johnson. His name is Bunch. His grandfather was owned by a white man that was named Bunch.
Would you mind telling me what your father's last name was?
My father didn't know his last name. My father got his last name from his grandfather, and his grandfather got it from his grandfather, who got it from the slave master. The real names of our people were destroyed during slavery.
Was there any line, any point in the genealogy of your family when you did have to use the last name? And if so, what was it?
The last name of my forefathers was taken from them when they were brought to America and made slaves. And then the name of the slave master was given, which we refuse. We reject that name today.
You mean you won't even tell me what your father's supposed last name was or gifted last name was?
I never acknowledged it whatsoever.
Okay, so that's also a lesson on how to stay on message when you're dealing with an interview. So the second clip I'm going to play expands the challenge to the prevailing discourse even further. And this was the kind of television coming out for the Nation of Islam. In 1959, a program called The Hate That Hate Produced, a documentary that featured a young Mike Wallace. He actually got his career started with this special, because after this, he was asked by CBS to cover the 1960 election, presidential election, and that's how he got his career started. But I'm going to play a short clip and then I'll add some comments, but I want you to pay attention to a couple of things, right? The way that Muslim or Muslim identity is deployed by Mike Wallace in his description of the subject, and also the different ways that he refers to African Americans.
While city officials, state agencies, white liberals, and sober-minded Negroes stand idly by, a group of Negro dissenters is taking to street corner step ladders, church pulpits, sports arenas, and ballroom platforms across the United States to preach a gospel of hate that would set off a federal investigation if it were preached by Southern whites. What are they saying? Listen.
I charge the white man with being the greatest liar on earth. I charge the white man with being the greatest drunkard on earth. I charge the white man with being the greatest swine eater on earth. Yet the Bible forbids it. I charge the white man with being the greatest gambler on earth. I charge the white man, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, with being the greatest murderer on earth. I charge the white man with being the greatest peace breaker on earth. I charge the white man with being the greatest adulterer on earth. I charge the white man with being the greatest robber on earth. I charge the white man with being the greatest deceiver on earth. I charge the white man with being the greatest troublemaker on earth. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I ask you, bring back a verdict of guilty as charged.
The indictment you've just heard is being delivered over and over again in most of the major cities across the country. This charge comes at the climax of a morality play called The Trial. The plot, indeed the message of the play, is that the white man has been put on trial for his sins against the black man. He has been found guilty. The sentence is death. The play is sponsored, produced by a Negro religious group who call themselves the Muslims. They use a good deal of the paraphernalia of the traditional religion of Islam, but they are fervently disavowed by Orthodox Muslims. These homegrown Negro American Muslims are the most powerful of the black supremacist groups. They now claim a membership of at least 250,000 Negroes. Their doctrine is being taught in 50 cities across the nation. Let no one underestimate the Muslims. They have their own parochial schools, like this one in Chicago, where Muslim children are taught to hate the white man. Even the clothes they wear are in sharp contrast to American dress, like these 2 Negro children going to school. Wherever they go, the Muslims withdraw from the life of the community. They have their own stores, supermarkets, barbershops, restaurants. Here you see a progressive, modern, air-conditioned Muslim department store on Chicago's South Side. Their story of hatred for the white man is carried in many Negro newspapers. Here you see their minister, Malcolm X, proudly displaying 5 of the biggest Negro papers in America.
Okay. I think that's enough of the clip. So you get the idea that in that clip, Mike Wallace used sober-minded Negroes, homegrown Negro American Muslims, black, and the Muslims, right? This is a result of the kind of challenge, right, that Malcolm, and even the clip that I played right before, that Malcolm and the Nation of Islam posed to the prevailing discourse of the ways, even the ways that white America talked about black people, right? And the way that black people talked about themselves, right? The other thing that's really interesting and important about this clip, and I think Tarek, one of your ex wants to know why people are fearful of black proprietorship, right? So this notion that, you know, an air-conditioned department store on the South Side poses a threat, right? Or the way that the young girls were dressed, right, which is clearly Muslim dress, right, is regarded as something that is anti-American, right? Because he says they don't dress like normal American children, right? So Mike Wallace is picking up on this geographical challenge, right? That the Nation of Islam and Islam in general introduced an alternative geography that challenged the territorial integrity, at least culturally or imagined, right, of the United States. And this was a real challenge that was carried through with Malcolm's travels to the Muslim world, Africa, and the Middle East. Now, many people believe that his first trip came in 1964 when he went to Mecca for the pilgrimage. But the truth of the matter is, Malcolm made a trip in 1959, and he writes almost passingly in the autobiography, Mr. Muhammad sent me on a 3-week trip to Africa. As Mr. Muhammad's emissary, I went to Egypt, Arabia, to the Sudan, to Nigeria, and Ghana. And he wrote for black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier in 1959 about this trip. Arabs send warm greetings to our brothers of color in the USA. This is Malcolm forging. This is in 1959. Malcolm hasn't left the Nation of Islam yet. That's why we can't disembody Malcolm and say, we'll take this Malcolm but not that Malcolm, right? Because it's all a historical progression. And this is Malcolm forging this shared geographical tie between African Americans and the African diaspora, as well as the so-called Muslim world. And he certainly carried this through. In 1960, he was one of the dignitaries of Harlem to meet with Fidel Castro at the Hotel Teresa. And this kind of reaching out on the part of Malcolm, of course, raised suspicions and questions from the FBI that had been tracking him since his days in prison. So in 1958, an informant, kind of did a study of Malcolm and filed this report. He's an excellent speaker, forceful and convincing. He's an expert organizer and untiring worker. He's fearless and cannot be intimidated by words or threats of personal harm. He has most of the answers at his fingertips and should be carefully dealt with. He is not likely to violate any ordinances or laws. He neither smokes nor drinks and is of high moral character. So they're like basically like sifting him to find what his weakness is, and this particular informant comes back with nothing, right? But the truth of the matter is the FBI and the New York Police Department's Bureau of Special Services conducted detailed surveillance on Malcolm X from the time he came out of prison for the New York Police Department, from the time he began organizing in New York, to tell you how deeply embedded these agencies were in Malcolm's organization and the Nation of Islam. In Boston, when Malcolm in 1954 was helping to build the Boston Temple, he began by holding small meetings in a private home, right? The first meeting held in a private home in Boston had 10 or 12 people present. One of them was an agent, right? So, you know, there are many people who look at the Nation of Islam's or Malcolm's language while he was in the Nation of Islam and the language of separation and say, well, you know, because they weren't part of what we consider the civil rights movement and the fight for desegregation, they really didn't challenge really didn't challenge any laws, right? But Malcolm's challenge was a different kind of challenge, right? It was a challenge that was it wasn't on the legal level, but it was kind of on the more fundamental narrative level. Malcolm challenged what it meant to be a citizen, a resident, a person who lived in the United States, right? He said, you know, I don't see an American dream, I see an American nightmare. He said, I'm a victim of American democracy, right? Malcolm was promoting a counter-narrative of citizenship than what was promoted by the United States. Okay, I'll skip that. But this brings us to his kind of next geographical expansion is when Malcolm went to Mecca to make the pilgrimage. And he wrote this famous letter back, and he kind of wrote the same letter to a lot of people. He sent postcards and of course sent a press release for his organization to read. I guess I did skip over the last slide because I didn't want to spend too much time on it, but so Malcolm, I guess I should, let me go back. So Malcolm, of course, leaves the Nation of Islam after a series of events that transpired in 1963 with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Kennedy is killed on November 22nd, 1963. Malcolm is scheduled to give a talk on behalf of Elijah Muhammad in New York on December 1st or 2nd, 1963, and Elijah Muhammad instructs all of his ministers to not make any comment about the assassination of the president. You know, it was a very tense time. You know, the country had never witnessed an assassination. You know, we had lost presidents before, but had never witnessed an assassination as they had. And so Elijah Muhammad instructed his officials to not comment, to not exacerbate the feelings anymore. Malcolm, however, responded to a question after the talk he gave when he was asked what he thought, and he responded by listing all of the grievances that many nations had against the United States and the way that he believed the United States was fostering violence abroad. The CIA, many believe, was responsible for the death of Patrice Lumumba. And many people believe that the United States was working to counter a lot of the anti-colonial and black liberation movements taking place in Africa, as well as the anti-colonial movements in Asia. And Malcolm basically said, you know, if you foster this kind of violence abroad, we shouldn't be surprised when it happens here at home. And he used the language of chickens coming home to roost. And many people saw this as mocking or delighting in the president's assassination. And for that, ostensibly, Malcolm was suspended. So there's a whole lot of other kinds of intrigue going on in the Nation of Islam, right? So one of the things about hegemony is, like, you can be counter-hegemonic and then impose your own hegemony, right? So the Nation of Islam was promoting its own kind of structural power over its members. And, you know, there were allegations about Elijah Muhammad's domestic life and, whether he had children outside of his marriage, and did he violate the moral code that he himself was promoting amongst his followers. There was a growing sense that Malcolm's kind of size in the media and his presence had exceeded the bounds of the Nation of Islam, that he was eclipsing the visibility of Elijah Muhammad. So all of these factors come into play, and of course there is the FBI who's keeping a very close watch on these differences that they can hopefully exploit. So Malcolm was silenced for 90 days, and Malcolm believed that the silence would never be listed, so he decided to leave the Nation of Islam. There are many ways to read his decision to leave. For the purposes of this talk, and framed in terms of geography, I look at it in terms of Malcolm's continual growth to expand his orientation in the world, right? Beyond the Nation of Islam. And so he goes to make the pilgrimage to Mecca and writes back this letter where he says, during the past 11 days here in the Muslim world, I have eaten from the same plate, drunk from the same glass, and slept in the same bed, or on the same rug, while praying to the same God, with fellow Muslims whose eyes were the bluest of blue, whose hair was the blondest of blonde, whose skin was the whitest of white. And in the words and in the actions and in the deeds of the white Muslims, I felt the same sincerity I felt among the black African Muslims of Nigeria, Sudan, and Ghana. We were truly all the same brothers because their belief in one God had removed the white from their minds, the white from their behavior, and their white from their attitude. And when many of the kind of mainstream press got this letter and press release, they said, aha, triumph. Malcolm has finally come around to seeing things our way. But if you look very closely at the letter, Malcolm puts white in quotes, right? And he speaks about whiteness as an attitude. He speaks about whiteness as a set of behaviors. He speaks about whiteness as a set of beliefs, right? And suggests that these behaviors, that these attitudes, that this set of beliefs needs to be removed or countered, right, in order for real brotherhood to prevail. So he was actually moving towards what, very early, he's kind of a pioneer in whiteness studies, right? Like scholars who've done the studies of the construction of whiteness and white privilege don't come along until the late 70s, right? But Malcolm here is moving away from a kind of genetic or essentialist notion of race to a notion of race as a socially constructed identity, right? That in the case of whiteness has to be deconstructed in order for brotherhood to prevail. And so, this kind of view was made possible for Malcolm in part because of his faith, in part because of the nationalist politics that was part of his family's legacy, that opened him up to an alternative way of seeing, of being, of speaking, and of acting, right? And this is why it is important when we think about Malcolm's legacy to not just think about him in terms of his black nationalist tradition or in terms of his black political tradition, but we also must think about Malcolm in terms of his faith tradition, because it is largely because of that faith tradition that Malcolm was able to construct a counter-hegemonic narrative for black people in America and Muslims, I would argue, throughout the world. So with that, thank you. I'm happy to take questions.